In the previous video, we took a deep dive into a few detailed but practical changes that could help make Ruins of Sarnath a less rail-dominant map. We did this by swapping some weapon respawn locations to encourage a more overall balanced flow between players, while also making some minor changes to the architecture with the goal of removing the possibility of players being able to run out the clock for minutes on end. And I think, were those changes enacted, they could be enough as a standalone update to the map. In this second part, I want to continue working with the alterations of part 1, but let's do so assuming that those changes weren't enough. Maybe they improved the flow of the map, but not to the degree we'd hoped for, insofar as giving players a viable alternative rotation to establish map control. Or worse, Part 1's changes exacerbated the problem of the player with railgun being able to dominate control by way of respawn trapping. So let's continue with where we left off, but in doing so, there were a few terms floating around that we should articulate for added context. So let's pause for a second to further flesh out layout, flow, rotation, and balance. When referring to a map's layout, I'm really only referencing the size and location of a map's rooms, their geometry and architecture, and the general placement of items in each area. Flow is a general term that describes how players move around a map and make their way from one item to another, and how seamless or obstructed that process tends to be. Maps with wider doorways and longer corridors tend to be larger in size, as they require players to accelerate to higher speeds in order to get from one side to the other. Rotation describes the path a player establishes to control a certain area of a map, its items, or a map in its entirety. This path and the control it gives a player is extremely delicate, as it is vulnerable to disruption by the opposing player at just about any point in time. On the topic of what makes a map balanced, I'm speaking to the specific capacity of each player to maintain or disrupt map control, meaning that whether in control or out of control, the players must always perform a type of balancing act when moving between the different areas of a map and its items. A properly balanced map does two things effectively. First, it gives the player in control not too many and not too few variables to account for, so that, when managed optimally, they'll be able to determine when and how far to deviate from their rotation when pursuing a frag, damaging the opponent, denying items, etc. Second, it gives the out-of-control player a certain degree of opportunity, not too much and not too little, in knowing when, where, and how hard to commit to a fight, damage the opponent, concede items, and so on, in an attempt to disrupt the opposing player's map control. To achieve a proper balance, no matter its size, layout, or flow, a map must fulfill these two objectives. One thing that always amused me about Ruins of Sarnath was this area behind Super Shotgun and above the lightning gun. It was as if the mapper had big plans for this part of the map, but then was forced to abandon them and just seal off this area because they ran out of time or something. Out-of-bounds areas should be obvious, like the Pits of Exile, Awoken Swamps, or places where players fall off the map, like on Molten Falls. They should not be random areas above other parts of a map. At one point, this area was clearly meant to be part of Sarnath, but that's not why I want it included. What Sarnath's layout seems to lack is an additional area that, while not a major point of contention, adds to the map's flow in a way that keeps players moving around it. What I mean is, if you want to control Sarnath's mega health, heavy armor, and both light armors, you can't do it without making hard stops in its current iteration. The presence of the railgun at the center doesn't help matters either. To control all four items, a player has to get from one side of the map to the other, from the very top of the map to the very bottom, and do it all without being obstructed by a railing opponent. It just isn't very feasible. However, if the railgun was relocated to the tribal room, like we suggested in part 1, and this area above lightning gun was open to simply connect both light armor rooms, players would have a freer flow to establish a rotation and avoid being trapped by railgun when respawning around the map. But how accessible should this new area be? Well, not very. I'd begin by knocking down this barrier at Super Shotgun, so it's only open to players on foot from here. Then, I'd erect a wall in the center room that players can rocket jump over, like at Nailgun. I'm a big fan of these boulders and the walls that players can jump up and take peek shots from, so I would have the exact same type of wall in this center room, making our area above the lightning gun accessible here only by way of the Super Shotgun or rocket jumping over, with another set of boulders for players to hop up sitting on the rear side, like at Nailgun. Now we just need to connect our new banana area with the other light armor room. Obviously, it's going to happen somewhere around the teleporter. I'm just not sure how to connect it with our new tribal location. It could be a staircase, another stack of boulders or boxes, making it take longer to go from tribal to banana, but definitely not a jump pad. However it connects, players need to be able to get up and down quickly, and like I said in part 1, the threshold should be large enough so as not to create the circumstances that allow for a kiting vortex to be exploited. So yeah, if ever the change is made, the mapper would need to decide what's best. For now, let's just go with a staircase that leads up from this tribal location and an open ledge or maybe a window that gives players standing back here some line of sight down our new corridor. On the other hand, we don't want to make this area too campy, so what items, if any, to put back here? Well, probably not much. Like I said before, the objective of this area is to connect both light armor rooms. Thus, it should be nothing more than a transitional corridor, like Banana on Awoken. The map has enough health bubbles and hourglasses, and I don't think Sarnath should become a 3 light armor map either. So I would simply relocate the Super Shotgun's 25 health bubble back here, somewhere behind our new wall, and maybe put that single hourglass we replaced the tribal with in part 1, opposite it. With these changes, we've now re-added the area above Lightning Gun back into the map, and made it accessible only by way of Super Shotgun, rocket jumping over the middle wall, or running up a staircase by our reworked tribolt. When making major changes to a map's layout, we need to consider how these changes will affect things like flow, how players establish an item rotation, and if the map is now more or less balanced overall. Maybe we've improved Sarnath's flow, but negatively affected its balance or vice versa. For Duel, I can easily see these changes benefiting a champion like Slash, but what about Deathmatch and Team Deathmatch? After all, this is one of the most played maps for those modes, and those modes have power-ups. So let's diverge from Duel to discuss other game modes for a moment, as these changes will also have significant impacts on those modes. At the moment, Runes of Sarnath has a single power-up spawn in the eyeball room. Considering our changes to weapon locations and the layout of the map, I would favor moving that power-up respawn location to the very center of the map, just next to our former railgun respawn. Putting the power-up here in a more central and neutral location would force players to completely change how they set up for it. In this location, it's far more vulnerable and gives players out of control more of a chance to make a play for it. While this might make more sense to complement our layout changes, what if we wanted to make our expanded version of Sarnath into a 2 power-up map? I also think these layout changes do introduce that opportunity. If we wanted to include a second power-up, I'd simply keep the current power-up respawn in the eyeball room and add the second power-up respawn here on the opening above the lightning gun room. Both locations favor players in control of their respective areas to grab the power-up, but for the second respawn, keep in mind that it would also be vulnerable from the lightning gun room, just like the eyeball room power-up is vulnerable from above and below. No matter what game mode these layout changes are adapted for, they introduce new opportunities to mix things up. Some players really can't stand 2 power-up maps because they add more of an element of randomness. Other players love it and revel in the chaos of having 2 power-ups to go between every 90 seconds. Many players love Runes of Sarnath just the way it is, and see things like kiting vortexes as giving a map its character, similar to Blood Run. And while I think they make a valid point, character shouldn't outweigh balance. Corrupted Keep is a great example of this. It's extremely fast-paced and players are highly vulnerable most of the time. And while it has its own quirks and flaws, it's able to find balance with a proper layout and flow. That is what I'm aiming for with Ruins of Sarnath. Thanks for all the thoughts you guys send my way. Definitely keep the comments coming, as I see these videos tend to provoke some good discussions. And I'll see you guys in the arenas.